The wind had a way of speaking to those who were left behind. It crept through broken chinks in the walls, curling its cold fingers under the door, whispering as it went. The house listened. The old boards groaned like tired bones, and the curtains, gray and thin, swayed as if keeping time with a song no one else could hear. She lay in a bed that felt wider than the prairie itself, though it was only a narrow cot pushed against a wall of peeling wallpaper. The pattern, once cheerful roses, had faded into something pale and sickly, like memories that refused to die but could no longer bloom. Her name, though no one had spoken it in weeks, was Clara. She was not old, not by years, but sickness had a way of stealing the youth from a face faster than time could. Fever had kissed her cheeks raw, and her lips bore the color of winter dusk. She stared at the ceiling where a small crack ran like a river through plaster, wondering if heaven looked anything like that, just a thin line away from where you are. The room smelled of damp wood and loneliness. On the small table near her bed sat an empty cup, its rim etched with the ghost of tea long gone. There had been broth 2 days ago, made from the last bone in the cupboard. After that, nothing but water and will. Outside, the prairie stretched forever. She had loved that once, the way the land held no fences, no walls, nothing to block the sky. But now that same open space felt like a cruel mirror to her own life. Vast, hollow, and full of winds that carried no voices her way. She coughed, and the sound startled her. In the silence, even breath could sound like thunder. She turned her face to the window and saw frost feathering its edges. Winter was not done yet. It had gripped the land like a fist, and in its palm, small things like her didn't last long. There had been a man once. Not a cruel man, just a weary one. He had come west with dreams that broke quicker than glass. When the sickness started, he tried to fight it, but men like him, men who feared standing still, always found a reason to leave. One morning, his boots were gone from by the door, and so was he. She never hated him for it. Hate takes strength, and she had none to spare. Clara closed her eyes and let the wind's voice fill the room. It sounded like water rushing through stones, like far-off cattle lowing at night, like all the lives she might have lived if things had been kinder. She thought of her mother's hands once braiding her hair by a lamp. She thought of running through wheat fields as a girl, bare feet stinging on warm soil. And now, here she was, bones on a narrow bed, counting breaths like coins. She whispered, though no one could hear, "If no one comes, let the earth take me gentle." And yet, when she opened her eyes, she felt something strange. A shift in the air. Not the wind this time, but a sound. Distant, slow. The crunch of boots on frozen ground. At first, she thought she was dreaming. Fever had brought dreams before. Voices calling from far hills. The smell of bread baking where no oven burned. But this sound was different. It had weight like truth. Footsteps, steady, drawing nearer. Clara's heart fluttered, weak as a moth caught in a jar. The door had not opened in weeks. Not since the day she sent away the neighbor's boy with a brutal smile and the last of her coins for medicine he never found. The boots stopped outside. Silence pooled thick in the room. She could hear the wind catch its breath against the eaves. Then, slowly, the latch turned. The door creaked open, and in the thin gray light, a shape filled the doorway. Broad shoulders, a hat dusted with snow, a coat the color of dusk. He didn't speak, didn't move for a moment, just stood there, taking in the sight of a woman lying in a room that smelled like cold and waiting. Clara tried to form words, but her throat was dry as prairie dust. Her breath trembled out, barely a whisper. The man stepped inside, closed the door with a care that surprised her, as though afraid the sound might break her. The wind hushed, and for the first time in many long days, the silence in that room felt different. Less like an ending, more like a pause. She watched him move toward the hearth, slow and sure. He bent, gathered what little wood remained, and coaxed a flame to life. Orange light spilled into the gray like hope that had forgotten how to glow. Clara let her eyes close, though not in surrender this time. She thought of how strange it was, after all this time alone, to hear not just the wind, but the sound of another heartbeat in the room. The boots that had carried him here scuffed softly on the floor as he settled by the fire. He said nothing. She said nothing. And in that stillness, a promise was born. The fire took its time, like everything worth keeping in this life. It crackled low, coaxed by hands that seemed to understand how to tame a thing without breaking it. She opened her eyes once more, and he was there, kneeling by the hearth, his hat set aside, his face bent toward the glow as though listening to the secrets of the flame. He was not young in the way of boys, nor old in the way of men who have seen everything. Somewhere in between, carved by wind and sun, a little worn, a little tired, like a trail that has been ridden too long but still runs straight. His coat hung heavy on him, dusted with frost, and his boots bore the stubborn mud of miles. She tried to speak, but the words splintered in her throat like dry wood. Her voice rasped out anyway. Why are you here?" He didn't answer at first, just placed another stick on the fire, slow and steady, the way a man moves when he's not looking for thanks or questions. Then, without lifting his eyes, he said softly, "A body shouldn't be left to the dark." There was no poetry in his tone, no grandness. Just truth, plain as bread on an empty table. She wanted to tell him to leave. That sickness clung to her like a second skin and might take him too, but her lips trembled instead. Her breath rattled like a loose shutter. She closed her eyes and let the sound of crackling wood fold around her like a blanket she hadn't earned. He moved then, his boots brushing the floor. She felt the cool dip of the mattress as his hand rested near. Not on her, just close enough that she knew she wasn't a ghost in that room. Fingers calloused from rope and reins touched the edge of her quilt, tucking it higher against her chin. "You're burning up," he murmured, almost to himself. Then he rose, the weight of his steps echoing through the hollow house, and she heard the creak of the back door, the slam of wind rushing in, then out again. For a moment, fear flickered in her. What if he left? What if that door never opened again? But then he came back, boots wet from snow, carrying the clean bite of winter in his arms. In his hands was a pail of water, sloshing softly like a promise. He set it by the fire, stripped his gloves, and warmed a cloth between his palms before laying it gently across her brow. The touch startled her, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. It had been so long since kindness came without condition that it felt almost foreign. The fever made her drift in and out, but pieces of him anchored her. The low hum of a tune as he worked, something without words, just sound rolling like distant thunder. The scrape of chair legs when he pulled one close and sat by her bed. The faint scent of saddle leather clinging to his coat. When she woke again, the fire had eaten most of the wood, and shadows danced like old ghosts across the walls. He was still there, hat tipped over his eyes, chin resting on his chest, asleep in the chair. One hand lay open on his knee, and in the other, he held the cloth he'd used to cool her skin, as if even in sleep he meant to keep watch. Clara stared at him, studying the lines of his face, how the lamplight softened them. She wondered what kind of man stays when he could go. Men like that were rare, rarer than rain in July, rarer than promises kept. A cough shook her then, pulling her from thought, and his eyes opened without startle, like a man who sleeps light from long habit. He rose at once, poured water into a cup, and steadied it against her lips. She drank in small sips, every swallow tasting faintly of iron and salvation. When she tried to thank him, he only nodded and said, "Rest now. The night's long, but you ain't alone in it." And that was all. No questions about her life, no pity spilling from his mouth. Just presence, solid as the chair he sat on, quiet as snow falling outside. Hours passed, measured by the crack of the fire and the slow easing of her breath. Once, when the wind howled hard against the walls, he rose and checked every shutter, every latch, his movements calm as a man fixing fence on a summer day. She watched through half-lidded eyes as he set his back against the storm, shoulders square like a gate no wind could break. Later, when the darkness thickened and even the fire seemed to whisper drowsy, she felt his voice touch the air again, soft, almost tender, like something not meant to be overheard. Maybe it was a prayer, maybe just a string of words a man says when silence grows too heavy. She couldn't catch them all. Only this. Don't let her slip away. Her throat burned with something that wasn't fever. She turned her face to the wall so he wouldn't see the tears cooling on her skin. And in that room where death had lingered like a shadow, life settled instead, quiet, patient, carried in the boots of a man who didn't walk away. By morning, the world had changed its shape. The window, once clear enough to let a shard of gray dawn through, was now nothing but white breath pressed against the glass. Snow piled high, swallowing the steps, the fence, the little trail that had once led out into everything she thought she'd lost. Clara woke to silence first, the heavy kind that follows a storm, but then came the wind again, soft at first, then rising like a choir of wolves. The sound curled against the walls, seeking cracks to slip through, but the house held, warm from the fire and from something else she couldn't quite name. She turned her head slowly and saw him. The cowboy. Still here. Still solid. He was crouched near the door, fitting an old blanket across the bottom to keep the cold from creeping in. When he straightened, their eyes met, hers hazy with sleep, his steady as stone. "You should have gone," she whispered, though her voice had little fight left in it. His answer came calm, like a hand smoothing rough boards. "Can't leave a soul to freeze. Not when I got 2 hands and a fire going." Then he crossed to the hearth and knelt, coaxing the flames back to life with kindling. His movements were slow, practiced, as if every gesture held meaning. He didn't rush, nothing in him did. Watching him was like watching a river, quiet on the surface, deep beneath. The fever hadn't left her, but it was lighter now, like a shadow thinning at the edge of day. Her throat still burned, and when she coughed, it rattled like loose nails, but the sound didn't scare him off. He only brought the tin cup again, his hand sure as he lifted it to her lips. She drank, eyes fixed on his wrist, where the pulse beat strong, a steady drum that made her remember what living felt like. "Thank you," she murmured when the cup was empty. He didn't answer right away, just set it aside and eased back into the chair by her bed. His hat hung on a wall now, his hair dark with the damp of melting snow. He sat with his elbows on his knees, hands clasped like a man who's waiting, not for something grand, but for something worth waiting for. They stayed like that a long while, the fire throwing light that danced lazy over the walls. Outside, the storm spoke in wild tongues, but inside, the quiet was a balm. It was she who broke it, voice small as a moth's wing. "What's your name?" His eyes lifted, meeting hers without flinch. "Luke," he said, as if the word had waited all morning to be spoken. She let it sit on her tongue like a drop of honey. Luke, strong and simple, the kind of name a man could live in without outgrowing. "Clara," she offered, though he hadn't asked. "I figured," he said softly, a corner of his mouth tilting just enough to stir something warm in her chest. After that, words began to move between them, not in torrents, but in trickles, gentle as spring melt. He told her the trail he'd been riding, how the snow caught him out by Dry Creek, how he aimed for the nearest roof and found her door instead. She told him, halting at first, how the sickness came, how neighbors stopped coming by, how the man who shared her roof once rode off before the frost set deep. Luke listened without shifting, without cutting in, his eyes holding hers like a rope holds a frightened colt, firm but never harsh. And for the first time in months, maybe years, she spoke without shame weighing down her tongue. Later, when the sky outside folded into the blue-gray of late afternoon, he rose and moved about the room with a quiet purpose. Found an old pot, scraped what flour and dried beans he could from her shelves, and made a broth that smelled faintly of thyme and smoke. He served her first, coaxing her upright with an arm that felt like a beam of oak beneath her back. She ate slow, each spoonful tasting of something more than food, tasting of care, of survival shared. And when she saw his hands, broad and rough from rope burns, curling gentle around the bowl as he steadied it for her, her eyes stung hot. Not from fever, from the strange ache of being seen. That night, the wind threw its fiercest rage against the house. Shutters clattered, snow hissed through cracks like whispers of ghosts. But in the small room, the fire burned bright, and Luke sat close. Not too close, just near enough that she could hear the low hum of his voice again. A tune without words, carrying the cadence of faraway rivers and lonely roads. "Sing it," she rasped, surprising herself. He glanced up, a flicker of something, amusement, maybe sorrow, passing through his eyes. "Don't know the words," he said. "Then hum," She answered, a weak smile trembling on her lips. So he did, and she let the sound pull her under like a slow, safe tide. When she woke before dawn, the fire still glowed, and Luke was by the window, his broad back bent as he whittled a piece of wood smooth. Outside, the storm had laid its white claim over everything. The road was gone, the world hushed, as if holding its breath. She lay there watching him, and for the first time in a long, long while, Clara didn't feel like a woman waiting to die. By the third day, the fever loosened its grip, though it left her weak as a foal on new legs. Clara sat propped against pillows, watching the pale morning creep across the frosted glass. Luke had opened the door earlier, just a crack, to let the room breathe, and now the scent of snow rode the air like a clean slate. She heard him outside, his axe biting into wood, each strike sharp and sure. The rhythm settled something deep inside her, proof that life still moved, that strength still stood where her own had faltered. When he came back in, his cheeks were ruddy from the cold, and his coat glistened with melted flakes. He set the logs by the hearth, knelt to stack them, and when the fire sprang high, orange light flared against the dark stubble along his jaw. She thought, for a moment, how easy it would be to love a man like that, a man who let his actions speak louder than any words. But before the thought could bloom, the sound of voices shattered the quiet. Low at first, then rising, the crunch of boots on snow, the rasp of a hinge as the outer gate banged wide. Luke's head turned toward the window, his eyes narrowing like a hawk catching sight of trouble. 3 men came into view, dark shapes against the white. Neighbors. Faces Clara knew once, though they hadn't crossed her threshold since autumn. They stopped short of the door, their breath fogging the air, their eyes darting toward the house as though it carried plague. Luke moved before she could speak. He shrugged on his coat, set his hat low on his brow, and stepped out, the door shutting soft behind him. Clara dragged herself upright, heart thudding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She couldn't hear the words at first, only the hard slice of voices in the cold. Sickness, don't want it spreading. Ain't proper for him to stay. She gripped the quilt in her fists, heat rising in her even as the room stood chill. They had left her to rot, every last one of them. And now that life had walked through her door wearing dust and quiet strength, they came with wagging tongues and warnings dressed as care. Through the warped pain, she saw Luke stand still as a pine, his shoulders square, his head tipped just enough to show he was listening. Then he spoke, calm even, but she caught the steel in it, the kind that doesn't need shouting. She ain't alone now. That's all you need to know. One of the men stepped forward, hands fisted. Luke didn't move, didn't reach for the iron at his hip. He just looked at them the way mountains look at storms, like they've seen worse and will outlast this too. After a long breath, the men muttered into their collars, turned, and trudged back the way they'd come. Snow swallowed their tracks almost as fast as they made them. When Luke came inside, the cold came with him, curling off his coat like smoke. He shut the door, dropped his hat on the peg, and glanced at her with eyes that held no storm, only steady, quiet light. They won't bother you, he said simply. She wanted to ask why. Why he risked their scorn, why he hadn't ridden on like any sane man would, but the words tangled with a sudden sting in her throat. So instead she whispered, "You should go. You've done enough." Luke crossed the room in 3 slow steps, the floor creaking soft beneath his boots. When he reached her bedside, he didn't sit, just stood there, looking down at her with a stillness that felt heavier than any touch. "I've been riding near all my life," he said at last, his voice low, steady as a riverbed. "Never found a place that made me want to stop." He paused, eyes holding hers like a rope that wouldn't break. Till now, the breath she'd been holding spilled out, trembling like light on water. For a heartbeat, the room was full of things unsaid. How she thought no one would come. How he came anyway. How love doesn't always roar in with trumpets, but sometimes hums soft by a bedside in the middle of winter. Outside, the wind died down, leaving the world white and wide and waiting. Inside, Luke reached for the chair, turned it so he could sit close, and took her hand, not like a man claiming, but like a man keeping a promise. The warmth of that touch stole the last of her fear, and as the fire climbed higher, she felt the truth settle deep. Some men pass through like dust on the wind, but some rare as rain and drought, come and stay. Epilogue scene cinematic. Spring came slow, as it always does on the plains. One morning, Clara stepped out onto the porch, her shawl wrapped snug, the prairie rolling wide before her in a quilt of green and gold. Beside her, Luke stood with his hands resting easy on the rail, the brim of his hat tipped against the sun. The land was the same, wild, endless, but her world had changed. Where silence once crouched like a wolf at her door, laughter lived now, low and warm, riding the wind like birdsong. She glanced at him, and he met her eyes with that same quiet surety that first stilled the storm inside her. No vow spoken, no grand speeches, just the truth, plain as the ground beneath their boots. He had stayed. And in a land where everything else moved, wind, cattle, clouds, a man who stayed was worth more than gold. Sometimes the greatest love story isn't the one that burns fast and bright, but the one that keeps the lamp lit when every other light has gone out. If this story stirred something in you, tell us in the comments. Was it the quiet strength, or the hope that blooms even in winter? Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs a little warmth today. And tell us, where in this wide, wild world are you watching from?